You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Brendan Cole. We're discussing whether marriage in the United Kingdom is on the decline. Now, half of 20-year-olds today will never marry. At least that's according to research from the Marriage Foundation, which shows a generational shift away from marriage as couples increasingly cohabit without taking the decision to go down the aisle. This is at odds with the baby boomer generation, among whom 87% of men and 92% of women have married at some stage. What do these changing statistics say about the institution of marriage? Is this any cause for concern? Well, to discuss this and the issues surrounding it, I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by Rosie Wilby, comedian, musician, writer and broadcaster. Also here in the studio, Dr. Mike Thomas, a lecturer in social work at the University of Kent, and Alison Ruoff, lay member of the General Synod of the Church of England. A warm welcome to you all. Alison, what do you make of these statistics from the Marriage Foundation? The wording was interesting because in its study it said that couples cohabit without taking the decision to commit. Do you think they're mutually exclusive? If you cohabit but don't marry, are you not committing?
It's a difficult one to answer. I would much prefer, if couples are going to get together, that they would marry and have that commitment, and that it be a lifelong sort of situation and desire on both parts. With regard to marriage, interesting enough, older people are now marrying and those numbers are going up. So amongst widows and widowers, which is brilliant, really.
Why do you think that is?
I think they just feel that they'd like to have somebody there as a really good friend, a partner, a lover, a person that they want to be with for the rest of their lives, and a companion above all else, probably.
I did see those statistics about people over 65s who are remarrying, but I guess they've kind of been steeped in marriage from a younger age, and given the proportion of baby boomers who did get married, they see it as a strong institution, or an institution that perhaps today's generation don't.
Oh, yes, that's right. I mean, I have a brother-in-law who's in his late 70s who a couple of years ago married a lady of 92. And this was his third marriage. And he said to me, well, what's the point of my travelling 150 miles round trip to go and visit her? So we're just going to get married, and anyway, we love each other. And I thought, well, why not?
Mike, do you think that current generations don't quite have the role models for successful marriages that previous generations did?
If we think about our parents as role models, we can look back to historical developments from the 70s with divorce law becoming more liberal, and we can see that people growing up today, divorces are fairly commonplace. So we can maybe blame marriage, actually, and the defects of marriage for the reasons maybe some people, certainly younger people, are not keen on marrying themselves because they've seen their parents split up, they've seen unhappy marriages around them when they've been growing up. Rosie,
do you see marriage inextricably linked with, say, educational, financial, employment opportunities, and that the more opportunities women get in jobs and in work, and they become financially more independent than, say, a generation or two generations ago, that they're less likely to get married?
Yes, so I think marriage, in the old days was, of course, very much a financial transaction. I mean, originally women were traded. I mean, that's why I sort of have very queasy feelings about the sort of patriarchal origins of it. But now women are more independent, and I think people in general are more individualistic, not necessarily selfish, but I think we pursue our own individual happiness. And of course marriage was never about that. It was about money. It was about living and sharing your resources, and now we sort of can do that more individually. And I actually love the idea of people being together, but I think modern culture is very fast moving, and I think things have changed very much. Relationships have changed very much. We live much longer. We have so many more choices, and I think marriage hasn't kept up with that. And I wholeheartedly agree with what Mike says about divorce. My partner is someone who went through her parents being divorced, and that's a terrible, terrible thing to go through. And I think, yes, we're now in a more serially monogamous culture where, yes, a lot of people might get married still, but a lot of people get divorced.
So your view is that marriage is based on a kind of transactional nature. I mean, that's quite a cynical point of view, some may say.
It is a financial transaction, and I think on that basis, it's absolutely fine. And I was very delighted when, as a gay woman, we got civil partnerships. And I thought, great, our relationships are recognised and there's a way of them being legally recognised. But I could not understand why on earth we would want this stuffy old thing called marriage, that it seems really archaic, has very patriarchal origins, as I've mentioned, and also is now completely muddied by people confusing it with love. I love celebrating love. I love being in love with my partner, and I want to stay with her the rest of my life, but I wish there was a different way that we could have a celebration of that and also do the financial business transaction and move in together and live together, which we're now doing after 3.5 years, and see that as a separate thing. I think we're muddying the waters. with this idea that romantic love lasts forever, when of course neuroscience tells us that it doesn't. And this sort of muddying of the waters means that people believe that their romantic love will last forever, and then they get disappointed, and that's when we see people breaking up. And serial monogamy, which is actually terribly disruptive. I've been through several long-term serious relationships now, and I wish I hadn't. I would have rather stayed with one person, and if marriage for gay people had been around 20 years ago when I started sort of having relationships, maybe I would have been divorced several times and much financially worse off.
Although the inverse of that is, if it had been around, you may have gotten married, and actually that would have been an argument for marriage, just marriage on your own terms.
To stay with one person. Well, I don't think I would have had the control over that, because some of my partners have left me, I'm afraid. They decided they'd fallen out of love with me, and I can't do anything about that. That is unfortunately what happens in a relationship. But I think we need to accept that love changes over time. It does become more of the companionship that I think Alison was mentioning. And I think nowadays, now that we live so much longer, we have to accept that some level of other relationships, whether they be sexual, emotional, or very deep romantic friendships, will happen with other people outside of that primary couple. And I think if we had an acceptance of a sort of slightly more non-monogamous, even though that doesn't have to be going and being very wild and having sex with lots of different partners, not focusing just that one person for the rest of your life, I think that would allow us to commit to one primary partner for a lifetime in a much easier way, if we sort of saw this as a pyramid of relationships with your primary partner at the top and other people, other emotional friends, work colleagues, family members, people you care about very deeply, all beneath that in this pyramid, maybe moving around and up and down, and things being a bit more fluid. I think marriage we still see as having very rigid rules around monogamy, which is something I find deeply problematic and a bit oppressive.
Alison, do you think we idealise marriage in a way? I mean, you would probably say that there's a religious basis to marriage as much as anything.
Absolutely there is.
Rosie's point is that it's more of a transactional nature.
Marriage is absolutely vital for society and the bedrock of society, and also for children. And that permanence that's needed in relationships with children. I mean, it doesn't matter who one is. If you haven't got a male and a female, you can't have children. And God ordained marriage for us so that we do the right thing for families, for parenting, and indeed for society. I mean, I know there have been periods of time when it's been a sort of financial transaction, but it hasn't always been thus. It's crucial that one makes a commitment, if you're going to get married, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health. And I remind me from time to time when my husband's driving me mad, from death to us till part, whatever it is.
Till death to us part, I think.
Yeah, that's right. So, he's 88. I passionately believe in marriage. It's jolly hard work. And the day we were married in All Souls, Langham Place, Central London, and the vicar said to us that to not let the sun go down on your wrath, and that was a very good thing to have said, that you work it out together, but you have to work at marriage. And I passionately believe it. I've been married for 40 years, which I know by some standards is not that much, but it's 40 good years, and we have 4 children and 7 grandchildren. And I would recommend it to anybody. And lots of people will say marriage is the best for family life, for society, and particularly for children.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Brendan Cole. We're discussing whether marriage in the United Kingdom is on the decline with Rosie Wilby, Alison Ruoff, and Dr. Mike Thomas. And Mike, the statistics do seem to bear that out, at least in terms of family breakdown. I mean, if you believe what sociologists say, that it's better to be brought up in a stable household, couples that are married are less likely to break up. I mean, what do you make of that?
Well, that statistic is certainly backed up in research evidence, but we need to really disentangle a kind of correlation effect from a causal effect. So if we think about the kind of people who get married, they're people who've been together, they're in a stable relationship, they may have stronger social supports around them, they may be economically more secure, because it costs quite a bit of money to get married these days, let's face it.
It doesn't need to.
No, but it often does.
Yes.
But it costs a lot of money to be single.
Yes, there are penalties for being single too, absolutely. But if we think about the kind of people who are getting married, they may be in a stable relationship, they may have tried each other out through cohabiting, because most couples do cohabit before they marry these days. So they may have a fairly sound basis for being together over the long term. Then they go on and have children. I think what we really need to think about is whether something magical happens when you get married. And actually, what we should really be thinking about is marriage is a kind of cementing relationships that have already got quite a strong basis. So we can maybe look at the differential between marriage and cohabitation in terms of a kind of trying each other out, a kind of self-selection.
But cohabiting is relatively new. I mean, that's much of the last 2 generations. I would say my parents' generation didn't cohabit. It wasn't seen as being socially acceptable.
Yes, exactly.
Perhaps in a generation's time it will be seen as the norm. Actually, people won't need to get married. They will just simply cohabit.
Well, that's an area, actually, where the law has really failed to catch up with what's happening in society, because a lot of people don't realise that cohabiting couples in the UK have very few rights.
Yeah.
This idea of common law marriage is really a fiction in law. So there's a real imperative for marriage if you want to cement the kind of legal rights that couples want around property, inheritance, next of kin rights and so on. So there's certainly that kind of advantage to getting married still. But in terms of what you were saying about cohabiting being more acceptable, I think it's quite a positive change that we don't have children stigmatised for being so-called illegitimate
But you know, things
these days.
go around in circles. I mean, there have been times when children born out of marriage, wedlock, have been so stigmatised. Now it's come back, but it doesn't stop this pendulum. It goes backwards and forwards. And I do worry for children for the future. I really do. I think it's terribly serious.
Well, I think we're at a point at the moment where being the children of a cohabiting couple, or the child of a single parent, actually, is less stigmatised.
Or the child of a gay couple.
Absolutely.
Same-sex couple.
Absolutely. I think we've kind of shifted away from this conformity, this stigma that goes with non-married families. And I think what's remarkable about the discussion we're having, we've had very different views of marriage from Alison and from Rosie. Yeah. What's remarkable is how adaptable marriage is and how marriage continues to evolve and change and make itself relevant. So if we think back to the Victorian period, where a husband took a wife from the bride's father, this kind of handing over of a woman to a man, if you like, this kind of idea of ownership. Few people would recognise that now as what marriage is all about. And then if we think about the 1950s, the nuclear family, very, very clear roles for men and for women. Yeah. Few people would accept that nowadays as a basis for a loving, equal relationship. We can think about marriage as being in decline, maybe numerically, but it's remarkable how marriage keeps on reinventing itself. So marriage is now really about individual choice, about a kind of a life project, making a life together. And we see now that same-sex couples are doing their bit in helping reinvent marriage again.
Have same-sex couples led to a renaissance in the desire for marriage? I mean, David Cameron expended a lot of political stock in something that actually, I mean, there were relatively equal rights for gay couples up until that point, but he really set his stall on gay marriage. Gay couples want to get married.
Well, some do, some don't. I mean, we have to think as well about the symbolic nature of marriage. So marriage is the way that in this country and in many other cultures, we acknowledge what is an acceptable adult, intimate relationship. And Rosie talked about the hierarchy of relationships, with marriage being at the top, really. And of course, if you deny same-sex couples access to that important pinnacle, you're saying something about where they stand in society. That's an important equality measure, I think, kind of putting right and injustice.
But Rosie, how do you feel about what you said in your first answer was effectively a patriarchal relationship, that is, or patriarchal institution of marriage being co-opted by gay couples? I mean, do you feel comfortable with that?
I think it is sort of was co-opted by Cameron. I mean, I think he wanted marriage statistics to go up. I mean, marriage rates, I think, are in quite poor health. I mean, I've been hearing radio programmes where it's been discussed, why are marriage rates at an all-time low? Why is marriage in crisis? So he probably was delighted that some people wanted to get married, and here's a group of people that will get married. I mean, I think he was sort of selling us back what we want, and in some ways gay people are perhaps less dangerous politically when we're sort of brought inside the tent, if you like, rather than outside protesting. You know, now we've got less things to protest about. I don't know. I have very queasy feelings about why it suddenly became something that a conservative
you think there's an
government
ulterior
wanted.
motive there?
Well, you know, there's always an ulterior motive, isn't it? I just think a lot of what I enjoyed about being gay in my 20s was actually a slightly more radical kind of agenda, and actually being able to be free to perhaps have slightly different relationship structures. I do believe now very much in settling down and being with one person, but like I said, I think I don't really buy this idea that marriage, with all that it symbolises, is the only way for two people to be happy and the only way to bring up children. I think children are surely going to be better off with two happy people, or even more than two happy people. My own parents, they stayed together, but a lot of the time they grumbled about each other, didn't seem that happy, had to work very, very hard, often enjoyed doing completely separate things to each other, took separate cars on holiday. And I only really, when my mum was dying of cancer, did I really see this wonderful tenderness and love. And to me, that was tragic, that actually I realised how much they loved each other after she was gone. And then my dad's been on his own for a long, long time. And I wish he had met someone else, like, Alison is saying about, people marrying again. But I've sort of seen, in a way, the sad effects of putting all your eggs in one basket and sort of just relying on that one person. What about if they're tragically taken away from you?
So do you think it's strange that the coalition government is really focusing on marriage? And we talked about the legislation aspect there, and Sir James Munby, who's president of the Family Division and head of Family Justice, has actually called on policymakers to have more legal fairness for unmarried couples. Say, for instance, if one partner dies, the other doesn't necessarily get the estate.
Well, there was a whole debate about whether civil partnerships should be opened up to heterosexual couples as well. And there were some heterosexual couples saying they would rather have that. Maybe they didn't want everything that marriage symbolised. So I think, yes, I think there should be different types of relationships that need to be recognised. And, I've got to meet a lot of people who have polyamorous relationships with more than one partner. And it's not this completely hedonistic kind of lifestyle. It's actually very ethical and very honest. And wow, I found those people were being way more honest than most of the monogamous people, married or otherwise, that I know, who would construct all kinds of power games and lies about affairs or things that they were doing, or, in this other world where there's just this priority on complete honesty. I found that so refreshing. I mean, I'm not saying that's something I could do. I think time management just makes it incredibly difficult.
There should be complete honesty within a relationship, shouldn't there?
But I was finding that there wasn't. I did a survey for my show, questioning and looking at where monogamy is now, and sort of asked what secrets people were keeping from each other, how many people had affairs, and the number of people that said they'd had an affair was scary. It was about 50%.
We're all human,
and we can't be too judgmental.
What for you constitutes a successful marriage? One that stands the test of time,
yes,
or couples that stay together even if they may be unhappy?
I think one that stands the test of time. I think you find unhappiness from time to time in any relationship, but you work at it together. I think God ordained marriage for us, for the good of society, and particularly from the children's point of view. And we must never forget them. I just think it's crucial that people do stay together and, as I say, work at it. There are all sorts of pitfalls that come along, but you go through them together if you possibly can. The fact that people are divorcing is the part of it, that they don't work at it. Another reason is because perhaps they married too hastily. I don't believe in having a relationship together before you get married. I believe that you keep each other special for the person you're going to marry, or you keep each individual. I do.
But how do you know you're compatible?
You just know.
Really?
Well, people have always known.
I don't think so.
Oh, yes, they do. Occasionally you get it wrong. Of course, people get it wrong. Yeah. But you do know. You fall in love with somebody and you don't have to get married straight away. No. I mean, we were engaged for 6 months. And there are lots of people out there that match with who you'd like or whatever. I mean, I often think that Christians are a bit slightly batty when they say there's just the one person. I don't think that's necessarily so.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Brendan Cole. We're discussing whether marriage in the United Kingdom is on the decline with Rosie Wilby, Alison Ruoff and Dr. Mike Thomas. One of the points Rosie was making, if I can see it correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, Rosie, but the degree of dissembling perhaps within a relationship, these affairs that do take place, and that in a way, through marriage, you're asking somebody to make a promise that they can't possibly keep.
Yes,
that
absolutely.
is I'm relying on you to keep me happy for the rest of my life.
You are going to try your best to keep that person happy.
Yes,
I'm
that
not
would be
relying
impossible.
upon yes.
Yeah.
And when I got married, I'm afraid I didn't promise to obey, which caused slight chaos.
Good for you.
Good.
Because I didn't think at that moment in time I really could, and I'm terribly glad that I didn't. So, I mean, my husband let me have my head, as it were, in many, many ways, and he's that much older. But we mustn't just degrade marriage as being something that's out of date. It's been going on from the word go. And it's a wonderful thing, and God doesn't make mistakes. He knows what's best for us. He knows what's best for children, and of course we do our own thing, and we live in a fallen society where we all make mistakes, and big mistakes.
What do you make of the increase of marriages outside of churches?
That's fine. That's absolutely fine. I'm delighted that.
But if they're not Christians,
they're not
Christians, and they don't believe that it's necessarily being supernaturally sanctioned, which a Christian would believe.
As a Christian, you make a vow before God
right.
to do your best in terms of that relationship and to stay with the other person. But if somebody who's not a Christian is going to get married, and they make a promise to the other person to be faithful to that person, I think that's wonderful and to be celebrated.
So
what does being faithful even mean? I mean,
it means sticking with that person with no sex outside that marriage with any other person.
But why is that purely defined along the lines of sex? This is the thing that I'm finding very problematic, because I asked people this question, what counts as infidelity? And yes, sex came top. Very, very close behind were much more emotional forms of cheating, like falling in love with somebody else without any sexual contact whatsoever. That actually rated very, very highly.
These think it's going to happen.
You know, even things like thinking about somebody else, you know, fantasizing about somebody else. 7 people had voted that as cheating, which I think, how would you even police that? I think it would be impossible.
Yeah, there isn't a single one of us that doesn't make some mistake in these relationships at some point or other. But it's a case of, can you be honest with your husband, your wife, your partner, and talk about it, talk it through.
Yeah, or even if you have an affair, I'm much more of the mind that then you can talk it through and repair it, and it could actually be in a strange way a good thing for your relationship. It's sort of thrown in a grenade and made you communicate, whereas I don't really subscribe to this idea that an affair means an automatic end to a relationship.
No, I agree.
I think that's very, very
it's about
sad.
confession and repentance and forgiveness, isn't it? And the word forgiveness is a massive thing.
Well, it's about boundaries as well, I think.
Boundaries, exactly, Mike.
I mean, I've done research with couples who've just got married who were about to get married, and for some of those couples, monogamy wasn't part of the deal at all.
Yeah.
And they were absolutely upfront about that. They negotiated it between themselves, so they knew on what basis they were getting married. They were going into it with their eyes open.
Were they going to have children?
Some of them had children, yeah, absolutely. But for them...
See, I think that's incredibly tough on the children when they see their parents sort of with another person and they know that their dad is their dad and their mum is their mum.
Well, there are different ways of doing it,
and I think it's selfish.
I think the point,
if their parents are happy, that's probably better.
Yeah, but that's
I think the
selfishness.
point Rosie made was quite an important one, actually, about the issues of caring and affect and commitment being much more important for some couples than purely sexual fidelity. If we think about marriage as a kind of caring relationship, sex is maybe a part of that relationship, but for many couples, the bond goes much further beyond that, actually. So there is room in some relationships for that. And I think the key issue is one of honesty, openness, and negotiation, really, in that. But again, this reflects this idea that marriage is continually evolving, and it's not what it was 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. So we should maybe be more optimistic about marriage than this research actually suggests.
And indeed, on that evolution point, Mike, I suppose if people still do want to get married, whether the proportion of people who get divorced after getting married increases, I suppose in kind of more agnostic times, there is still a desire for stability by other means. I mean, do you see marriage perhaps as a kind of proxy for that sort of church going that we used to have?
One area we haven't looked at in this discussion is the economic side of things. So for most couples, the key commitment in their lives is the mortgage. And if we think about why younger people aren't marrying in such great numbers, some of them simply can't afford to. They can't afford to get on the property ladder. They can't afford the big, lavish celebration that they aspire to. And there's some enforced cohabitation going on because people simply can't afford to live by themselves.
You don't have to buy a house. I mean, we're a nation in Europe where the people who own their houses is very high. Lots. I mean, take Germany, for example. Just about everybody rents.
Absolutely.
We've got this ridiculous idea. We've got to have a property and you've got to have a white wedding. Bunk. You can have a very simple wedding on a very, very reasonable budget. It's a case of this aspiring to something which is ridiculous.
Well, you know, it's interesting you say that. I think that's an absolutely valid point. But if we are all socialised, we're all brought up to believe in the white wedding. We can blame Cinderella for that. We're taught about Cinderella from our very, from very young age, and all the fairy stories are geared towards marriage and the happy ending. And in terms of home ownership, I'm afraid home ownership has become much more entrenched, actually,
as part of the fairy tale.
As part of the fairy tale, absolutely.
So, Rosie, it sounds like we've been sold a fairy tale from a very young age, and it's very hard for us to shake that off.
Yeah, I mean, I feel broken-hearted, really. I desperately wanted that fairy tale as much as any young girl, even though from a fairly young age I realised that it was going to be slightly different for me because I was gay. But I still wanted that romance with one person. But I've realised that it's actually better to have the honest answers and choices in front of me and realise it isn't quite like that. Just see what alternatives there are and how we can be honest and ethical and respectful to other human beings and live our lives together in a way that reflects that.
But Rosie, even if that's not for you, do you accept that for some gay and lesbian couples, it's absolutely legitimate to want to pursue that, to want to have the kind of wedding and go down that road,
but
even if it's not for you?
I'm worried for them. I'm worried for them because I think they've got a lifetime of a lot of heartbreak and divorce ahead, because I don't think that if you fall for the fairy tale and you think that's what marriage is going to be forever and ever, then the reality of it is actually a bit of a bitter pill to swallow. And I think we need to be realistic and know if you want to get married, which I still might because of all the financial implications, there's legal stuff, it's all, I love my partner very much, but I think I would want to do that with my eyes open and, knowing that we will kind of fall out of romantic love and have more a companionate relationship, and maybe at some point we may have other lovers. I don't know. I'm not sort of saying that would definitely happen, but just to sort of have
would
an open.
Would she be happy with that?
I don't know. We've absolutely not ruled it out, but like I say, we're not doing that at the moment either. I think it would be a difficult thing to discuss, but I think actually ruling things out can sort of make you then want them. It's almost like in the art gallery when something says do not touch, you desperately want to touch it.
But surely stability within a relationship, that the other person is not going to go and have an affair on the side, at least you hope and pray that they're not, is part of the relationship. Why you get up in the morning and rejoice that you're there with that other person.
If they have feelings, connections, sexual or not, with other people, but they still choose to come back to me, that would actually be more kind of fulfilling for me than somebody who's just obliged to stay because they've made this legal commitment and we're worried about how messy and expensive it would be to get out of that. They're actually choosing me. There are all these other people in the world that they kind of love and have good connections with too. I quite like the idea of even marriage being a bit like a mobile phone contract where it sort of expires every couple of years and you choose to renew it. I like the idea of choosing your partner again and again and again rather than just, I might as well stay, that kind of resigned kind of.
But when parents get divorced and the children are in their 20s, say, it comes as the most incredible blow to even people at that age. And I just think we forget how divorce affects family relationships and particularly children of all ages.
Yes, I know. So that's why we should get married in an honest way rather than sort of in this slightly fairy tale way.
But one thing we've also forgotten is how the lack of access to divorce affected families. So there were couples and children trapped in incredibly unhappy, abusive, dysfunctional relationships. And what we've forgotten now, I think, is the impact of not letting people divorce, not letting people acknowledge when things haven't worked out. So perhaps if we think about Rosie's views around marriage and there's a kind of long-term permanent thing, there's perhaps hope for marriage to be seen now as a more kind of a flexible project, if you like, and this idea that actually it will work for as long as it does work, and then when it doesn't work, you bring it to an end, and maybe you'll go off and marry somebody else or have a different kind of relationship. And I think that kind of flexibility is a sign that marriage is going to endure. So we should actually be more optimistic about marriage.
Well, the one thing we decided when we got married was that if we did divorce, neither of us decided we would ever remarry. Simply because I believe as a Christian it's not right to divorce and remarry. So we made that was the only thing we talked about, apart from having children. And I'm glad, because, as I say, it's just this stability that comes to families, the wider family, and the children look to you as, of course things go wrong, of course they've seen Fred and me having arguments and rows, and they know that we do, but we are still together, we can make it up, and the children greatly respect us for getting it right together. together. But when you see relationships torn apart with divorce, it's always the children that suffer.
Some very different views there, but many thanks for joining me. That's Alison Ruoff, lay member of the General Synod of the Church of England. Also here in the studio, Rosie Wilby, the comedian, musician, writer and broadcaster, and Dr. Mike Thomas, a lecturer in social work at the University of Kent. Thank you for joining me, Brendan Cole, on The Voice of Russia in London.